Hi guys, this is Mark Westbrook. I'm going to go ahead and do a presentation of Joseph Brown's Their Lawn Scars Touch Ours, a reflection of the poetry of Michael Harper. I'd like to apologize in advance. I have been a little sick, um, but just please excuse it. Okay, I'm going to go straight to how Brown uses the critical race theory lens in his article. Before I go any further, I'd like to explain what critical race theory is, as I was a little confused by it at first. I'm going to provide a couple of quotes and some definitions to hopefully help you guys better understand it. Critical race theory is when CRT scholars attempt to understand how victims of systematic racism are affected by cultural perceptions of race and how they are able to represent themselves to counter prejudice. I got the definition from PurdueUniversity.com. You'll notice I underlined and bolded that sentence because throughout his article, Joseph Brown strongly focuses on how Harper tries to reflect himself through his culture by calling on his ancestors. The other definition is CRT recognizes that racism is ingrained in the fabric and system of the American society. CRT examines existing power structures to evaluate the presence of racist policies and belief systems. A quote I found was from Angela P. Harris, American legal scholar. She says, CRT, or critical race theory, is a commitment to a vision of liberation from racism through right reasoning. So for her, CRT is a positive thing, as it's a recognition that racism is an issue in society, and it's calling that out. And throughout the article, Joseph Brown makes it very clear that Harper is trying to call and sees his job as to be a voice of the suffering of his ancestors to try and bring how racism is an issue in America. My definition is that, in the most simplest terms that I feel I can explain it to you guys, is that critical race theory is recognizing that racism is embedded in American history and is an issue. So again, as we go through Joseph Brown's article, or at least my summary of it, hopefully you will see how critical race theory is playing in Joseph Brown's paper. What proves Brown is looking through a critical race theory lens as he analyzes Harper's poetry? I got 3 big points on here. Throughout the essay, Brown examines what issues there are for Afro-American poets when trying to imitate English white poets in society. Brown examines how Harper is calling on Afro-American ancestors in his poetry to combat the suppression of whites. Brown is recognizing that racism is an issue and is claiming how Afro-American poetry is based off that historical suppression and separation. To Brown, if racism didn't exist, you would not have great poetry from Harper, Hughes, Brooks, and so on. Poetry that calls back to their suppressed Afro-American ancestors. Finally, to Brown, Harper recognizes the answer to prejudice is to embrace his ancestors, calling on previous Afro-Americans to influence his art and recognize that the scars of his ancestors, as well as the scars of any who are racially categorized, is a commonality and a unifying factor between races. At the beginning of the article, Joseph Brown proposes, very bluntly, he kind of proposes an issue that Afro-Americans have, and that is Afro-American poets have been challenged, dismissed, or accepted on the basis of their control of European and Euro-American techniques. The usual result was that Afro-American artists were found never quite as good as the inspiration. Afro-American could not write the same poetry as Euro-Americans because they came from a different culture. That's what he basically is saying from this quote. It's not based off of ability, it's because of culture. We could take this another way and vice versa. Euro-Americans cannot write the same poetry in the style of Afro-Americans as they are not from that culture. To take this a little further, or to better support what Joseph Brown's trying to say, Robert Del Perk in Poetry and Pedagogy, A Memory of Michael Harper Teaching, he suggests that Harper would agree with Brown's statement, as Robert sat in a class where Harper taught them that culture is form, form is culture when it comes to poetry. In other words, again, if I'm from an English white culture, my poetry is going to be based off of that, and then that culture will be based off that poetry. So since African Americans can't write poetry as good as like Whitman and the classical English traditional poets, Harper's solution, according to Joseph Brown, is that he does not try and draw inspiration from traditional European white poetry. Instead, Harper identifies in his poem with previous Afro-American poets and artists. A quick little side note, after I did this presentation, or I finished it, I did read Etheridge Nights for Black Poets Who Think of Suicide, and that poem is almost a complete copy, I would say, of Joseph Brown's paper, or at least his main arguments in summary. Because in that poem, Knight recognized that black poets should not try and write poetry like white poets. Knight recognized that the focus of black poetry should be to call on the ancestors and their deeds and suffering and to bring that truth to light. That's what made Afro-American poetry good. A quote from that poem that helps best show this was when he says, "Poets are organs of black sorrows. They are the trumpets of black warriors. Let all black poets die as trumpets and be buried in the dust of marching feet." And as Brown proves, that is what Michael Harper does with his poetry. He calls back to his ancestors. So I think Etheridge would be proud of Brown and of Harper, or at least he would agree with them. Going back to the article now, these are the poems that are mentioned, that Joseph Brown goes in depth with when trying to make this argument about how Harper calls on ancestors to influence his work. Reuben Reuben and Dear John, Dear Coltrane are in the reading book for this class that we are taking. However, Joseph Brown goes strongly in depth in Alice and Song I Want to Witness. Now, the first poem that he really makes this case, and I think he goes the most depth with, trying to prove how Harper tries to show that critical race theory is an issue in America and how he's trying to address it, is in Alice, and how Harper's trying to continue a chain of preserving African American culture. Let's just go ahead and look at the first part of Alice. I did not want to copy and paste Alice in this presentation. I was afraid of copyright infringements, so I'm just going to go ahead and do a quick summary of the two parts. So in the first part, Alice Walker, she's a famous African-American novelist. She's surrounded by snakes, and it's symbolized by oppressive whites. She uses her writing to conjure a previous oppressed African novelist, Zora Hurston, for guidance. By clinging to and modeling the works of Zora, who modeled the works of previous African-American artists, the African-American culture is preserved. And then in the second part of Alice, Harper continues this chain of preserving Afro-American culture, for at the end of the poem, he calls on Alice to have an influence on his work. So let me see if I can try and explain this in the clearest way possible. So Zora Hurston calls on her ancestors. In her writing, she called on her ancestors and looked at their oppression, and her work was viewed as great because of that. Then Alice Walker comes along, and she copies Zora Hurston and asks for Zora Hurston to be an influence on her and to be possessed by her. And so because she calls and reflects on Zora Hurston, her writing becomes great. And now, because Harper is doing that in this poem, because he's calling on Alice Walker, and he's asking Alice Walker to have an influence on his art and to be possessed by her, he recognizes actually in the poem, now that he's possessed by her and he's calling out to her, his poetry will be great. And so he is continuing this chain through poetry of preserving their ancestors and being a voice for their people and their suffering. We see this example also again in Dear John, Dear Coltrane, and another poem. So similar to Alice Walker, how she conjures and then possessed by her ancestors or Hurston to be inspired and a voice for her ancestor, Harper goes through the same ritual when writing about John Coltrane. In Dear John, Dear Coltrane, he is the audience to Coltrane's music. I think when you guys read it, you'll see that he's listening to the music. But later in his life, Harper is going to write another poem, and it's called A Narrative Life and Times of John Coltrane. And in this poem, he starts humming and singing the same song that he was listening to in Dear John, Dear Coltrane. This, as Joseph Brown tries to argue, this is trying to show how Harper is no longer a listener to Coltrane's music. He's no longer just conjuring Coltrane, but he's being possessed by Coltrane. Just like how Alice Walker conjures and is then possessed by Zora Hurston. This is taken even further past just the race of African Americans. Harper tries to extend this even further to Native Americans. to show how the critical race theory is not just an issue with African Americans and uh, how blacks are suppressed, but any minorities are having issues in America. But at the same time, he puts a positive spin on it, and I'll go ahead and show you how. In the poem Continuous Visit, Harper conjures and reflects on the suffering of Native Americans. A good quote to show this is he says, "The Indian is the root of an apple tree, history, symbol, presence. These voices are not lost on us or them." Brown suggests in his paper, Harper, once open to the voices of his ancestors, allows himself to become a child of all who have been scarred by America. He goes on in the paper to try and show how through this poem, Harper is trying to not just be a voice for African Americans or a prophet for African Americans. He's trying to be a voice and a prophet for any that suffered. Uh, this suggests that Harper feels like he can connect with Native Americans as they were the first to suffer under oppression by prejudice in America. What's cool about this poem, I felt, was that and he doesn't really explain this in the paper, but I felt that's what Harper was trying to get across, is how it breaks down racial divisions. Hence the title of Brown's paper, "As Their Lawn Scars Touch Ours." So he never says it breaks down racial divisions, uh, but because the Native Americans were scarred by the suffering of the whites, and now that you have African Americans being scarred, their scars have stretched out and have connected themselves with each other. So how can we take this and apply this process that Brown does at looking at Harper's poetry? Well, I basically went through the book and looked at all other African American poets, and I wanted to see, do they go back and do they look at, in their poetry, do they constantly just go back and look at previous African American artists and their ancestors and call on them for inspiration, reflect on them, be a voice for their suffering? Is the subject matter a majority of the time previous African Americans in history? And actually, I was very surprised to find out that yes, just like Knight was trying to say in his poem, yes, they were. For instance, in Gwendolyn Brooks' poetry, she calls and reflects on Malcolm X in the poem Malcolm X. The dead boy and the boy died in my alley. Her sisters who didn't change their hair to those of my sisters who kept their naturals. Her dead ancestors in From Africa to the diaspora, as well as in Young Africans. And quick side note, I know she doesn't really talk about musician and artists, like how Harper is always focusing, especially on John Coltrane. He seems very focused on jazz music, and he's trying to incorporate in his and become one with those past musicians. Brooks doesn't really associate her poetry with past musicians, but she does focus on the ancestors or previous blacks who suffered. Another was Robert Hayden. He conjuring the Afro-Americans on the slave ship in Middle Passage, the junkie and elegies for Paradise Valley. Now, it doesn't say he's African-American, the junkie. It doesn't say he's African-American, but he does say in the poem how the officers looked like they had tears of hatred for their kind or his kind. So you can assume that the junkie is an African-American. And then also he refers back to his ancestors of the African Juju men in Odea Dallas, Fly Away Home. So what does Joseph Brown's approach have to the working of our course? Well, hopefully I've shown you guys how it helps us look at the subject matter of African American poetry and maybe show a cause of why that's their subject matter. It bluntly points out that Afro-Americans will struggle with trying to imitate English traditional American poetry, and vice versa. English whites will struggle with trying to imitate Afro-American poetry, not because of ability, but because of culture. And like Knight says, because they maybe not because they're just not able to, but because they don't want to. They want to continue to focus on their culture alone. This also provides strong suggestions to why Michael Harper, as well as other Afro-American poets, chose to write about ancestors and other struggling blacks as their subject matter. I think I've already said that. And one could go into further study in a paper of how much one's culture determines what poetry he or she will write. So I was wanting to do the imitation project, poet imitation project, the creative writing portion for this class. Um, my favorite poets so far in this class have been Afro-American poets, and so I was really wanting to imitate one of them. But if we were to take what Brown says and kind of what Harper says with how culture reflects, poetry comes from one's culture, they're basically saying I won't ever be able to write poetry like those African Americans because that's not my culture. I might explore this more in the imitation project, or I might write a project paper about how does how much does my culture affect my poetry. I just like to look more into that. I thought that was just a bold statement. Some key things I learned: Brown's theory and technically Harper's as well is about culture being the basis of poetry. I've already talked about that. Also, there is a commonality of Afro-American poets drawing on their oppressed ancestors for inspiration, or at least acting as the centerpiece of their poems. And this was, again, that's what made their poetry good. And at the same time, it was a tool to address critical race theory in America, which brings me to my last thing, is critical race theory. Uh, Hopefully I've taught you guys a little bit about what critical race theory is. If you haven't heard or learned anything about it before, I haven't. So hopefully that was beneficial for you guys as well. Here's the resources that I used. If you guys want to actually look at the article, and that's it. If you guys have any questions, leave them on the forum. I'll do my best to answer them the best that I can. And you guys have a good rest of the semester. I've really enjoyed having you guys' comments so far in all of the discussions that we've had. You guys have been a pretty awesome class to be working with, and I really appreciate it. All right, that's it.